Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us. I have the pleasure of introducing Julie Germann and Erica Olson. And I will say I worked with Julie on local issues. I've heard so much great things about Erica, so we are in for a treat. I wanted to start just by sharing just a little bit of the work that Julie has done. When I met her, she was fresh from Minnesota, if I'm correct, and had been doing work with Praxis International around prosecution work, but like really multidisciplinary work. I'm actually in the process of finding their bios. I somehow changed my screen, so let me take a second to make sure I have the right information. But I will say we are definitely in great company. So as I mentioned, Julie Germann is a JD, is an attorney. She's the founder of Finding the Right LLC, where she trains and consults nationally in criminal justice fields, including sexual assault, intimate partner violence, child abuse, and the use of expert witness and trauma-informed practices and firearm surrender. Erica Olson has 20 years experience in direct services and advocacy addressing interpersonal violence. She has served on SARTs, DVRTs, and 2 CDC initiatives, rape prevention and education program, and national violence death reporting systems. Ms. Olson has co-authored curricula, legislation, and regulations on inter-partner violence and provides local and national trainings. Leadership roles include Census Director of New Jersey Domestic Violence Fatality and Near Fatality Review Board. She's also a global ambassador for Women's International and boards of directors for Respond Against Violence, on the board of director for that group. Through Anassa Consulting, Ms. Olson provides consulting and training in intimate partner violence and trauma-informed victim-centered management. So thank y'all for joining us. We will be able to take questions in the chat, so feel free to type in and I will help to make sure we get those read out. Thank you and welcome, Julie and Erica.
Thank you for that amazing introduction. I would have written a lot shorter stuff if I had known you would have to read all that. And I just wanted to say gracias para todos and thank you all for being here with us today while Julie gets us going.
Yeah, sorry. I thought I had this ready.
You know, you didn't come for Tech 101. That's definitely not our presentation today. So thanks for your patience.
All right, can someone give me the high sign if that looks like our front screen? Thank you. As Erica said, welcome everybody to Factions and Fractures. We are really excited that you're here today. Eric and I have both had long careers, you've already heard about that, but very committed to interdisciplinary work and what it takes to sustain interdisciplinary work. And that's what we're going to talk about today, the challenges that has come with all these hashtags that you see on the screen before you. We're going to skip over who we are. You heard enough about us already, but we don't know much about you. And so throughout today's presentation, we're going to be using something called Mentimeter. On the device you're using to watch this presentation, you can just open a new browser and go to mentee.com, or from your smartphone, tablet, anything else, go to mentee.com. And if you enter the code listed there, 88023435, you'll be able to answer our question, which today is, what superpower would you like to have? If you could have any one superpower, what would that be? And if you, I will say, if you leave your Mentee browser open, or on your phone, leave Mentee open. Erica's showing you there in the screen what it looks like on our smartphone. It will advance to further questions throughout our presentation. So let's see. Now you should be seeing the Mentee's word cloud, the Mentimeter word cloud. So some of the superpowers that all of you would like to have is teleportation, healer, telekinesis. Wow. Flying, that would be awesome. Freezing time, luck, photographic memory, that would be awesome too. Erica, what would your superpower be today?
Mine was, I would infuse everyone with empathy. Just a little touch, like a Marvel superhero. That would be mine. How about you, Julie? What's yours?
You know, I think mine would be, I would like to make some copies of myself so that I could be in multiple places at one time.
These are great. Oh, I love some of these. Right? Oh, peacemaker. Beautiful.
Be one with the force. I like that. I like that a lot. So we could have asked you what your job was or something really boring like that, but I think we're learning much more about each one of you by knowing what superpower you think would be a good one to have. So I appreciate all of you who've participated in this. Each Mentee quiz that we do today will be slightly different, but will be the same concept. You go into the mentimeter.com in a separate browser, separate device, and you'll have the ability to answer questions, and we'll see them in real time on the screen.
Nice.
All right. Well, thank you to all who've participated and for all who would share our love of having a superpower.
Reading minds to detect abusers. I just caught that one in the chat. Right on.
A truth detector, that would be, I have 4 kids, so I would really like that truth detector. I pretty much can tell the lies because they all have their tells, but.
All right, thank you guys.
Okay, thanks for participating, and that's just kind of how that's going to work today. So there will be some others as we move along.
So won't spend too much time on this slide. I know sometimes the descriptions in the agendas can be a little bit short. What we want to go over today is we want to discuss what's the justice gap. What does that look like? How do we define that? How do multidisciplinary efforts really cover the justice gap? How do they bridge that? And how have they been able to do that effectively? What are the challenges, both traditional and current? And then we're going to give you some key takeaways for how you can really overcome some of those challenges, including the viral and polarized climate that we find ourselves in, and bridge that gap so that you can sustain your teams to weather the storms. You're going to find that we do a lot of puns, we do a lot of jokes in our presentations. And so we're going to be using the bridge as an analogy. And so Julie's going to talk first about what is that justice gap.
So I'm probably preaching to the choir a little bit on this one because we know that you all do amazing work in the area around sexual violence. But what we've known for a long time is that the pathway to the courthouse for victims of interpersonal violence and sexual violence is not a nice straight road. In fact, what we know is that we have these gaps. And the first one is that very often these crimes are not reported to law enforcement. We know that 1 in 5 women and 1 in 71 men will be sexually assaulted in their lifetimes. But only 1 in 5 cases of sexual assault gets reported to police. More than 80% of all rapes go unreported. And we know this funneling down of sexual assaults actually gets worse from just the 80% that are not reported. Only a fifth of the ones that are reported will actually be investigated. Very often there will be no arrest made. If the case is prosecuted or pursued in any fashion, the offender will remain at large in the community. This funneling of cases, if we start with, say, 100 sexual assault cases and only 20 are reported to police, by the time we get down to the prosecutor, 5 cases are referred from law enforcement to the prosecutor, and the prosecutor will charge 20% of those, or approximately 1 case. And we know that for every 100 rapes that are committed in the United States, less than 1 person will spend 1 day in jail for those 100 rapes. And that funneling effect of cases has been seen consistently in data over time. So this gap that our victims feel when they're trying to seek justice feels huge and insurmountable. One of the things that we've done to try to bridge that gap, to try to offer some justice to these victims, are multidisciplinary teams. And multidisciplinary teams have been effective in many regards in bridging that justice gap. We have research and practice over 30 years that have demonstrated that different multidisciplinary teams and collaborations have produced effective, sustainable results, improving safety, decreasing violence and harm, improving physical and mental health outcomes of victims, reducing, making efficient use of resources. Now, within sexual assault, we talk about SART teams, and SART teams have created such amazing improvements for our victims. We found that cases were reported more quickly. More forensic evidence was collected. In fact, it was SART teams that were responsible for expanding the number of hours that we can collect SART teams and making that nationalized practice. Victims and survivors were more included in the process. We saw more cases brought to prosecution and prosecuted successfully. And more convictions occurred when we worked collaboratively in that SART team. Eric is going to tell us a little bit about DVRT teams.
It's really quite similar, and I know a lot of you might work in both spaces, but again, for at least over 30 years, it's really been the gold standard of practice. We know that DVRTs, or whatever name they often come by, we know that they significantly lower risks of re-victimization. Survivors and victims are much more likely to receive services. We're able to improve mental and physical health and well-being. We're able to help them prepare better to safely leave their batterers. And we know that the multidisciplinary teams are really effective at promoting greater engagement for survivors to work with prosecution and to get convictions. There are certainly traditional challenges to MDTs, right? And I think we all are really familiar with those. These are agencies that don't participate, members that end up being uncommitted. It could be funding, it could be turf wars. I don't think we have to, Austin, right? Austin SART issues a few years ago is certainly a perfect example of that. And so, although MDTs are incredibly effective, there are still those traditional challenges that end up making multidisciplinary work messy, difficult, tricky. And what you can end up is having groups that either splinter off or spend most of their time sort of doing a blame and shame game, right? There's no real effective collaboration.
So I love this image of these monkeys, because what we found early on in the movement to create SARTs, to create MDTs, is that we very often did not work and play well with others. We were so siloed that we really did not want to hear from other disciplines about what we thought another discipline might be doing wrong or right. We kind of just wanted to keep doing our own work. And what we learned is, whether you call something an MDT or a SART, just slapping a label on it does not get those effective results that we saw at the beginning of the presentation, that it really does take something more. And, you know, the example that I really like to look to where we've seen so much good evidence of an MDT that wasn't working was Missoula, Montana, because the DOJ went in there. Lots of you have read the Missoula book, probably, but the DOJ went in there and investigated when sexual assault cases were not being handled properly. And when you read the letters and the reports that came out of Missoula, what you saw was all the problems that arise with MDTs. And what you realize is that at the time that was happening, Missoula actually had a SART. So you can't just say when there are problems with sexual assault investigations, just throw a SART in there and that will solve everything. Because what was going on there included, you know, a lack of communication between the different agencies, insufficient communication between law enforcement and prosecution, not sharing. If you were going to decline a case as a prosecutor, not telling law enforcement what it would take to make the case prosecutable, not including advocates, not letting advocates be part of victim meetings or part of prosecution meetings. So there were so many problems in working together, despite the fact of a SART. And really, what we know is when we look at that Venn diagram, in the right corner of the picture is that the victim lives at the very center of that Venn diagram, and she has to be touched by all of our agencies. And so the only way to do good work with survivor victims is to make sure that those agencies do the hard work of working well together. All right, here we go. We're going to try it again. Pull out your browser, your extra browser or your smartphone, go to Mentee. And what we want to hear this time is, what are the biggest challenges your multidisciplinary team struggle with? So if you're already part of a team and it's struggling, or you're trying to start a team in your community and you're having trouble getting that going, what is it that's making your team less effective than it can be? So you go back to Mentee, it's the same code, and I will go advance the question if I haven't already. Let me.
So again, you guys will stay right where you are in your Mentee. Julie is going to refresh it on that platform, and then you should be able to refresh as well.
I'm hopefully getting there. Just a few too many things open on my screen today. All right, Erica, are we sharing the Mentee?
We are, it's up on the screen, and okay. You all, if you hit refresh on your tab or on your smart device, you should now see the new question. And you can type in your answers and then submit them, and they will start popping up on the screen.
There we go.
Beautiful. So what are some of the biggest challenges? Power dynamics. Pretty interesting in a field where power dynamics are everything, right?
Mm-hmm. Attendance, I think that's huge. I've been on multiple multidisciplinary teams, from SART teams to child abuse teams to domestic violence teams. And although we're all super busy professionals, but one of the things I saw folks struggle with a lot was this just was not high enough priority. Attendance at the meetings was last on their list.
I see member buy-in, which we're going to talk about. I see follow-up. I see communication. We're going to talk about all these later on. Yeah. And all of your answers, by the way, are anonymous. We may or may not have said that, but just so you know, no one, your answers are all anonymous. So feel free.
They just pop in as whatever you type. We don't see where it comes from.
Yeah.
The time to do it. I agree that's a challenge because you all are hugely busy. You have big caseloads.
Starting from nothing. Yeah. Resources. Language barrier, which Tassa is doing an amazing job of trying to bridge. Not committed to change. Oh, we're going to talk about that as well.
Starts and does not last. I can't tell you how many communities I've worked with who've had their multidisciplinary teams start and start again, how to get that sustainability so that when your one driving force leaves or takes a new job, your team doesn't fall apart.
Accountability. How? Where's the teeth in what comes out of meetings? No structures. We are going to talk about that. I don't know. We might better get going. We have a lot to get to.
I agree. I agree. Thank you for sharing all of this. We hope that we will be addressing these things as the presentation goes forward. Remember, you can always use the chat box if you feel like we're not getting your questions answered. So.
Okay, so this is for you martial arts fans or Bruce Lee fans out there. I'm a black belt, so I had to mess with the hashtag. We've gone over some traditional challenges to multidisciplinary teams, particularly SARTs. But we want to now explore how has hashtag activism in particular impacted multidisciplinary teams and those community collaborations.
So I think you're all aware of hashtags, right? We see them all over the place. If you're a big Twitter user, you see them. You'll still see them in Instagram. You'll see them in Facebook, all your social media platforms, you see hashtags. But the rise of hashtag activism is something that we maybe don't think about specifically or how it affects our job. So hashtags were first created by Chris Messina, who was a Google developer. And in 2007, he wanted to create a platform where people could have an organized conversation around a specific topic. He wanted that platform to be accessible on your phone, all of your devices. And he wanted this open sourced where people could be encouraged to share whatever their thoughts were. And his vision really came true in hashtag activism. So the oldest known use of that term came from The Guardian in 2011, where it was mentioned in the context of the movement Occupy Wall Street. And then we moved on, and the one that we're probably all very familiar with, right? In 2006, Tarana Burke first coined the phrase Me Too to help survivors and raise awareness about just the pervasiveness of sexual assault and sexual abuse. But shortly after the story about Harvey Weinstein broke, that's when Me Too really took off as a hashtag moment. And Alyssa Milano asked survivors to respond with Me Too if they had ever been sexually harassed, sexually abused, sexually assaulted. And of course, we know that within 24 hours, Me Too had been posted over 500,000 times. So that was followed by other movements, right? So one hashtag movement is not going to stand alone. We were followed by Time's Up and Him Too, which was a counter protest to hashtag activism, saying that all of these people who are after those who would sexually abuse are really, you know, unfairly targeting men. And maybe you did or did not see this, but, you know, Peter Hansen's mom famously complained that these radical feminists were ruining her son's life, not allowing him to date. And, you know, these ideas of false accusations were just so rampant. And to his credit, Peter Hansen came out and said, I don't feel this way at all. I love my mom, but she's a little nuts here, right? And I support and believe women. And you know, also a nod to Twitter that the game was on point because they had to raise it to that next level of funniness, right? With the Him Too. So we can see how these movements got started, and not just around sexual assault, but around domestic violence as well. In September of 2014, there was a video of Ray Rice knocking his wife unconscious in an Atlantic City hotel. And immediately the questions for her motives to stay with him were rampant across the internet, I guess. And Beverly Gooden created this hashtag Why I Stayed to encourage women to share their stories of why they stayed with their abusers. And again, within 24 hours, thousands of Twitter users had used this hashtag to talk about their experience of being in a violent relationship. And another hashtag moment that we're all very familiar with, right? Black Lives Matter. It started in 2013, following the acquittal of George Zimmerman. And not to be undone, it was followed by the counter Blue Lives Matter, and created some controversy, right? So while we see that hashtag movements can sometimes bring about social change, they can bring about an awareness that maybe lots of the community didn't have before. They can also be very polarizing and putting people on opposite sides of an issue, or making people think that they're divided on opposite sides of an issue when maybe their opinions aren't as far apart. But even seeing some of these that have arisen, right? Are women divided over the Me Too movement? Are these calls to reform, defund, and dismantle the police, right? Does that mean we hate all police officers? This idea that the policing system is broken and needs to be changed.
So I think Julie's headlines and her slides really visually capture that there are pros and there are cons to hashtag activism. We know that activism in general is what led to multidisciplinary teams like SART, right? And now that we have a global viral platform through social media and through hashtag activism, there are definitely sort of two sides of that coin. The pros are that hashtag activism can educate the general public on issues. It can really raise awareness and support, and it can positively impact that justice gap. For example, like being able to set up multidisciplinary teams. It can really reveal the level of violence and harm of sexual violence, rape, and assault. This is really important, particularly in cultures where it's taboo to talk about these things. And so the real scope isn't known. The hashtag and the viral activism can be positive because it can really serve to connect survivors. It can give them a sense of belonging, of visibility. This is important for counteracting abusers' tactics of gaslighting and isolating them. And it's important that it can go viral and global. It's an incredible way to engage in systemic change. But we also see the cons, I think, from what Julie has shown, particularly when we're talking about multidisciplinary work. If we're not careful, we end up in echo chambers. We stop actively listening to different points of view and information. We can end up stereotyping, and we can get into an either or an othering. So if you are in favor of reducing lethal police brutality by some officers, you hate all cops. Or if you say, you believe all survivors, then you are just a man-hating feminazi. We dehumanize and we oversimplify. And this really escalates any other political, social, or religious divisions that are already current in a community or society. And that heightened awareness of that abuse really drives us to find someone to blame sometimes more than it does to actually solve problems. And in the end, if Julie doesn't mind advancing to the next slide, here's what you get. Animosity, defensiveness, you get a breakdown of trust, polarization. These are the things that weaken teams, and they really lead to a collapse. And again, I think we're preaching to the choir when we talk about Austin and what happened with the SART and the SART team and the multidisciplinary relationships here. Thank you for Kayla for the shout out for those puns. And so what we really need to do is we need to figure out, okay, so what's the answer? If this is the kind of time that we're living in, what's the answer to building back these bridges sustainably?
So civil engineering, another one of our puns, right? But how do we get back to a place where even if we've become polarized politically on different issues, we can be civil with one another, we can rebuild relationships and work effectively as a multidisciplinary team, because we really know that effective teams and multidisciplinary collaborations are built on just two things, right? Relationships and processes. And if you get those two things right, everything else is going to fall into place. So we're going to be sharing now some concrete keystone practices that you can incorporate into your teams to either build new relationships or repair relationships and processes, so that the bridge you're building can sustain to carry those victim survivors to justice. So this is one of my favorite quotes, right? Individuals can resist injustice, but only in community can we do justice. And I know that's why you're all at the TASA conference, right? I know that's why you all do this amazing work, is because we want to see justice done for victim survivors. And that's really what a SART's role is in system change. To recognize your unique and powerful ability to really ask good questions about what currently is, so that together we can shape what should be.
Julie, I'm just going to pause. Kristen brought up a great point that we've been talking about Austin and SART, and that there are a lot of advocates and survivors at this presentation. And she wanted to know, and they had been involved in that community response, and she asked if we could add a little context or explain further. I think you were here. I moved here fairly recently. Do you want to share just a little bit of context about the Austin SART?
Sure. So, you know, I came into the mix when things were already going, I would say, sort of south with the Austin SART situation. So certainly if someone from TASA wants to chime in, I would not be offended at all. But I believe that Austin had a very successful SART that had done some amazing work to move processes forward for victim survivors in the community. And then we, you know, as happens when you have elections and you have turnover in offices of who is your elected official, there can be changes in priorities and opinions about those kinds of things. And we had some very important parts of a SART team withdraw from that team and actually, you know, attempt to start their own team. And so without the prosecutor and without law enforcement actively participating, which is what happened in Austin, really a SART team really loses its ability to bring about change for victims. And so there was a lot of divisiveness. At one point, there were actually two separate teams. Not everyone was invited to both teams. Some of the invited parties wouldn't attend one team. So that's kind of what happened there.
And we can definitely, we can do some more context, maybe if we have time at the end, but I really appreciate you bringing that up, Kristen. And I'm going to speed through a little bit more just so we can get to some of the takeaways from this presentation. But maybe if we have time at the end, if there's anybody else who wants to speak up about that, wonderful.
Absolutely.
So, well, there you go. So as we discuss the splintering of teams, arches to arches, trust to trust. The reason that the bridge is such a powerful metaphor for teams is because they really do have to work that way. So here I've got a picture of the Montopolis Bridge. It was built in 1938 and it is still open to pedestrian traffic. And this is what they call a truss bridge. So besides it's lending itself to puns, you'll notice a triangular structure. And what trusses do is they capitalize on the tension and compression of multiple joints and angles. And multiple disciplinary teams, again, much like a SART team or a DVR team, they really can do the same thing. So number one, the way that you design your team, like Julie was just discussing, who is at the table? Do they have a real voice or are they a token representative? That's important. The types of processes and protocols that you have that we're going to get into a little bit later are important, but so is maintaining your team, right? Maintaining those relationships. And you have to watch out for corrosion, just like bridges. And the number one thing that is so corrosive on a multidisciplinary team, particularly in trauma work, is blame. And I think nobody does a better job discussing what blame is and how it harms than Bree Brown. So we're going to let her take it away for a moment.
Sorry, there we go.
How many of you are blamers? How many of you, when something goes wrong, the first thing you want to know is whose fault it is? Hi, my name is Bree. I'm a blamer. Let me just tell you this quick story. So this is a couple years ago when I first realized the magnitude to which I blame. I'm in my house, I have on white slacks and a pink sweater set, and I'm drinking a cup of coffee in my kitchen. It's a full cup of coffee. I drop it on the tile floor. It goes into a million pieces, splashes up all over me. And the first, a millisecond after it hit the floor, right out of my mouth is this: "Damn you, Steve." Who is my husband? Because let me tell you how fast this works for me. So Steve plays water polo with a group of friends. And the night before, he went to go play water polo. And I said, "Hey, make sure you come back at 10, because I can never fall asleep until you're home." And he got back like at 10:30. And so I went to bed a little bit later than I thought. Ergo, my second cup of coffee that I probably would not be having had he come home when we discussed. Therefore, and so the rest of that story is I'm cleaning up the kitchen. Steve calls, caller ID. I'm like, "Hey." He's like, "Hey, what's going on, babe?" What's going on? So I'll tell you exactly what's going on. I'm cleaning up the coffee that spilled all, like dial tone. Because he knows. How many of you go to that place when something bad happens, the first thing you want to know is whose fault is it? I'd rather it be my fault than no one's fault. Because why? Why? Because it gives us some semblance of control. But here, if you enjoy blaming, this is where you should stick your fingers in your ear and do the na-na-na-na thing, because I'm getting ready to ruin it for you. Because here's what we know from the research. Blame is simply the discharging of discomfort and pain. It has an inverse relationship with accountability. Accountability, by definition, is a vulnerable process. It means me calling you and saying, "Hey, my feelings were really hurt about this," and talking. It's not blaming. Blaming is simply a way that we discharge anger. People who blame a lot seldom have the tenacity and grit to actually hold people accountable, because we expend all of our energy raging for 15 seconds and figuring out whose fault something is. And blaming is very corrosive in relationships, and it's one of the reasons we miss our opportunities for empathy. Because when something happens and we're hearing a story, we're not really listening. We're in the place where I was, making the connections as quickly as we can about whose fault something was.
Erica, if you want to start talking about the next slide while I do the
I'm on
magic to bring it back. Thank you.
I'm on it. I'm going. We're going to keep our timing. So I love this, right? Blame has an inverse relationship with accountability. Think about when, for those of you who do direct service with survivors, what do you avoid at all costs, right? Blaming, shaming. It's the inverse. And so when we want to hold, whether we want to hold perpetrators accountable, or we want to hold systems or systems players accountable, judges, law enforcement, attorneys, the blame game, it's a losing one. It absolutely is the inverse in terms of having a relationship with an accountability. And what it does really, when you think about blame and the fear of blame, it really sets up 3 self-destructive cycles. When you start to blame, when you just start to lash out and discharge, you get a cycle of inaction. People, they stop taking initiative. They stop being vulnerable, like Brene Brown said. They look to managers or people that have authority to solve problems. That next cycle is then people become afraid. They're afraid of being blamed. How many of you know that person and you would rather do anything rather than make them mad or cross them or have a direct conversation, right? We don't want to. So then individuals and whole systems hide mistakes. They don't learn from them. And then we make more. And then the last cycle is the cycle of infighting. Again, so common on multidisciplinary teams, particularly in trauma work. People want to deflect blame. There is low trust. There's no cooperation. Everybody gets defensive. And the best example of this is, I think, house training a puppy. I don't know if there's any dog lovers out there, not trying to ignore the cat lovers or the hamsters or the lizards, but dog training to me is a great example of this, because what happens, old school training is they pee on the carpet, they peed on the carpet, and you rub their nose in it, right? You drag them over, you rub their nose in it, and you tell them, no, bad dog. But then what happens? Do they quit peeing on your grandmother's rug? Of course they don't. They just hide it. And then what you're left with is not a dog that's been trained well to not pee on your grandmother's antique carpet, but you're left with a big pile of problems, let's just say, and no accountability and no change, which is most important for survivors. So how do we move from this cycle of inaction and ignorance and infighting to a culture and a system that actually results in change for survivors? And the way that we do that is by providing that culture of accountability. So accountability versus blame, this is what it looks like. Teams that have a culture of blame are going to differ in their beliefs, in what they're focused on, and naturally, they're going to end up in very different results. So I want you to think just for a minute about what most closely resembles your team or your community collaboration efforts. And you want to think about the bridge analogy. If you want to move from a culture of blame to a culture of accountability, you have to think about how do you capitalize on those different points of view, on those different tensions. How do you channel those for the good of victim-centered, forward-moving action? And the way that you can do that, excuse me, is you think about those arch bridges, and they have what is called a keystone. If you've ever seen a keystone bridge or an arch bridge, it's that one center block that really capitalizes on the tension of the other little blocks. And what we want to do is teach you some fundamental keystones that you can do practically as individuals and as teams to really move into a culture of accountability.
So the first keystone that we think you need to make a strong team is clarity and agreement. And I want you to think a little bit about any sort of relationship you've had where what have your disagreements been about? And usually, whether it's with a partner or a best friend or someone that you work closely with, usually it's about unmet expectations. I entered a marriage expecting that men clean the house. And so if I have that expectation and I don't communicate it, and then my new husband doesn't clean the house, I am hopping mad, right? And if I ask myself why, it's because I had this expectation that the house would get cleaned and it wasn't met. But I also didn't communicate that expectation. And so Eric and I like to talk about clear is kind. We need to be clear in our expectations. within our teams, we need to set agreed upon expectations. They need to be mutually agreed upon and explicit about what your role is on that team and what your job is, right? So if there is a mutual expectation that everyone comes to meetings, participates, and is on time, we need to be very clear about that up front. Also, what is the mission, purpose, and scope of this team? Having a well-defined mission or purpose can actually reground a team that's gone off the rails a little bit, right? That's about to careen off that bridge. For a multidisciplinary team that's centered around child abuse, stopping the infighting and saying, remember our mission, our purpose is to keep the child at the center of everything. Are we doing that today? Right? So having that well-defined purpose. Explicit roles and responsibilities, and I'll share about this a little bit more, but very often communication breaks down when we have unmet, unrealistic expectations, because I believe your role and responsibility is something that it's actually not, or I believe you as a professional have the power to do something that you don't do. So really setting out these expectations in a clear, well-defined, agreed upon space is the very basic foundation to having your team function well. So here's an example from my own experience of kind of the opposite of well-defined communication and expectations, right? This story I tell myself, and we all do this, right? So we're seeing or hearing something in real life, in our job, and we tell ourselves a story about it based on our expectations, based on our experiences. So here was a case with this was an advocate's experience, what they were hearing and seeing, but a particular detective we worked with who always has his gun holstered and visible, even when meeting with a victim, even when it doesn't seem necessary. He always also wore sunglasses inside or outside the building. So the story this advocate told herself about that is he's really a macho cowboy kind of guy, you know, just being a tough guy, really unnecessary. The victim survivor in this case was a very young and attractive woman. And the officer started to ask very detailed questions about the bra that she'd been wearing on the night of the assault, including what material was it, right? Was it lacy? What was the cup size? What was the brand and color? And now this wasn't a brand new advocate, and she had sat with many victims during their interviews and never heard this level of detail asked about a bra before. And so the story this advocate continues to tell herself is, this guy's really just being kind of voyeuristic and creepy. He's asking about this bra because she's young and attractive and he thinks she wears Victoria's Secrets or something else. He's really re-victimizing her. This guy's a jerk. So by the time the victim advocate pulls the detective out into the hall with an "I need to talk to you," she's pretty hot, right? She has told herself this story about what is happening. But when she actually had a conversation with the detective, it didn't match the story she'd told herself at all. He, in fact, had recovered a bra from the crime scene. And he was hoping that by description, she'd be able to describe it because its location and presence at the crime scene would be great corroborative evidence. So his intention was really good, but how the victim advocate was hearing that was really not very good. So when we talk about being clear, setting expectations, we need to have some honest, uncomfortable conversations on our team. On the screen now are some questions, some ways that you could go about that. Asking, what is one belief or perception that I have about you or your position? What is the belief I have about officers or prosecutors? But allowing the flip side of that, right? So what is one belief you have about me? Having that conversation, what would make our contact easier? One exercise I've done on a team that was so successful was together as a team, everyone in the room got to write what they thought my job was as the prosecutor. They got to write it on a whiteboard. Everybody else in the room, the advocates, the police officers, the SANE nurses, everybody in the room. But then at the end of that, I got to go up and say, yep, circle this one. It is my job. No, I can't do this. This only judges get to do this. You know, I wish I could do this. I can ask for a search warrant. I can't grant one, you know, and it was surprising, despite the fact that we had spent years working together, how many misperceptions there were about each of our jobs. And we repeated that exercise for each discipline to give everybody the opportunity to clear up misperceptions about our different professions. So we'll give you another chance to go to Mentee and let us know this time, same mentee.com. I have to go in and advance the question. So why don't you take the question, Erica, while I do the technology work?
You got it. So since we can't be in person and all do this on white paper, this is one of those keystone practices of being very clear with other people that you're working with about what you can and can't do. What's your role? What's your purpose? And also, what are your restrictions? What are things that you can't do? So in this new Mentee question, we'd love for you to type in, what is one thing that you wish other professions knew about your profession? And that might be as a field in general, it might be as your specific role. Say if you are an advocate on SART team, or if you're a SANE nurse or law enforcement, but whatever it is, we'd love to hear from you. What's one thing you wish they knew, whether it's what you did or what you have to deal with, or restrictions, or just you as a person? Oh, these are amazing.
Oh, you know, I just have to say I have goosebumps a little bit because I feel the power of your words. I am human too. I am not perfect. How difficult my job is. The emotional side of it.
How isolating it is. How compliance is not always fun. I'm not a social worker. These are just fabulous.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I'm trying the best that I can.
You wish that they had a better understanding of the role an advocate plays with individuals and systems. And I have to strongly agree that that is one of the most misunderstood things particularly for law enforcement and prosecutors. I train prosecutors across the country, and I usually have advocates attend my sessions and come up and say things to me like, my prosecutor won't talk to me. How can you help me fix that? Right? So at that very basic understanding, that we each bring things to the table that help.
Julie, can you scroll just a little bit?
You know, it's
stuck.
It's locked up.
That's okay. Locked up like a team that can't move forward. There you go.
Yeah, I apologize. I can go back out, but looking at our time,
that's okay.
I wonder if we should just move on.
Yeah, these are fabulous, though. Thank you guys for being so open and vulnerable. These speak to me as a veteran, having done the gamut. These are really powerful. Thank you guys so much. So I know that in a lot of these, moving forward with our presentation, we have talked about getting locked like that, those power struggles, and how do you change that? Like, we can talk about it, but what does it look like in real life? And how do you start to loosen some of that and use it to build that trust again, right? Trust and trust. In one way, there's this choice map. It was designed by Marley Adams, and I frequently have posted this, whether it was working with Domestic Violence Fatality Review Board or other SART teams. And we use this to help us get unstuck. So whether you're doing case reviews, maybe you're doing assessments or an audit, maybe you're just looking at some high-risk cases, It's a great map. We can send you the link to this later, or you can look it up. But this is really good to have either posted at your meetings or in maybe if you have an MDT handbook, which I highly recommend. That goes back to having something explicit, having in writing. And what you're really doing is you're trying to help everybody on your team turn judgment into curiosity. We all know that we get half our exercise from jumping to conclusions. We do. I mean, if I had done that during COVID, I'd be fit as a fiddle by now. But what you need to do is turn disagreement into shared exploration. It helps to start to turn that defensiveness into self-reflection, right? And then you really move from assumptions into questions. And this, if you use this map and you start talking about these things, you really can start getting people's mindsets to switch. And Julie's gonna talk a little bit later about what that looked like in practice for her that she was working with. So we're gonna move on to one of those main keystones. So how do you make this map happen, right? How do you get this started on the team? And the first keystone is feedback, right? And the best way I can sort of give this analogy is it's this like having spinach in your teeth. So you go and maybe you have a really important presentation in front of fundraisers. Maybe you have to testify as an expert witness, or maybe you are really trying to convince some folks to make a decision. And you come home and you look in the mirror and there is a huge chunk of spinach in your teeth. And you go, wow, why didn't somebody tell me? Nobody could concentrate on my message with that thing hanging out there. And you ask, why didn't you tell me? And there's two reasons typically. One is that you didn't ask. You know, before I go up on stage, I'm going to go to Julie and go, got anything in there, girl? You know, you have to ask for it. Or it's because they felt so uncomfortable and so embarrassed, they didn't want to tell you. They don't want to be in that position. So how do we start to break that apart? One is how you ask. You have to ask, but only ask if you're ready, and only ask in a way that really builds trust and really builds that openness, right? And then even just asking establishes rapport. If you're vulnerable enough to say, do I have something in my teeth? It means you're ready to hear. Maybe you've got something stuck in your teeth. And what I mean by that is maybe you're getting in the way of the message. Maybe you're the one that's getting in the way of the purpose. Maybe it's the way you talk or your tone or your defensiveness. And then you need to think about receiving feedback. The only proper response is thank you. That's the only response to give when you either ask for feedback and you get some you don't like, or someone just pours it on you. And the reason is because if you start to shoot the messenger, you're going to stop getting messages. And that's that breakdown in communication. That's that breakdown in that bridge. And the other part, the other keystone practice that you can incorporate in your teams is how do you provide and discuss feedback that doesn't get everybody defensive and angry and really digging in their heels in those power dynamics. So there's sort of a three-step method. First is talk about the actual observation or behavior. Don't personalize it. So if on your team, you think someone is racist, right? Going up to them and starting calling them names is probably not going to get them to look inward. So talk about what you see. So for example, you know, we were doing the case file reviews, and I've noticed that there's a really disproportionate number of exceptionally cleared cases for Hispanic victims. I've noticed this pattern. Next, you want to approach it from that place of inquiry, right? You want to be a fact finder, not accusatory. So rather than following that up by, and that's because you and your team of detectives suck or are racist, is, have you noticed the same pattern that I have? Have you seen that as well? Have you seen this pattern? And then last, you always want to focus on moving forward, right? Shame is backwards looking. Blame is backwards looking. Focus and accountability is moving forward, which is you might get some new details. You might just have to acknowledge whatever it is that they say. But then you go, okay, you know what? Thanks. I see maybe there's more circumstance. Maybe there's more context. oh, you know what? I didn't realize that the data system for capturing data on those cases is outdated and I'm looking at the wrong data. Thank you for that. So providing and discussing feedback is a little bit of an art, but at least now you can move forward rather than look backwards.
And to provide a context for this, I think sometimes we get frustrated, especially if you're the person who goes to a training like this and you're like, all right, I'm all good to give and receive feedback, but no one else on my team came to this training. No one else has this information. So how do we integrate it as a whole team? So an example on my SART team, when we were going to address a concern and observation, we had it written into our protocol, how that was going to happen. So for example, I got an interview on a case and it was terrible. It had no good information in it. And as I dug deeper, I realized it's because the victim was not provided an interpreter. So she wasn't allowed to give the interview in her first language. And so she didn't understand the question. She couldn't respond and give all of her facts to the officer. And so I could bring that to the SART team and call the law enforcement officer who's on the team out on the table for not doing that. But our protocol said that when you had an issue with a case, you would address the discipline before the meeting. So I called up law enforcement and I said, I'm bringing this case to SART because there was an issue with an interpreter, but I give them the heads up in advance that it happened. So this is what happened. And we started from a place of inquiry, right? Does the officer not know about the language line? Was there not an interpreter available at that particular time of day? You know, how can we correct this moving forward, both on this case and how it doesn't happen in the future? So by the time we came to start to discuss it, law enforcement has addressed it with the specific officer, had taken steps at roll call to let everyone know about all the different interpretation options available to them. And so they could report back that, yes, we did have this problem on this case, and here's what we did to address it. In that way, no one felt blamed and shamed in the middle of a meeting. And it really put this feedback practice that Erica showed you into our protocol and into our process.
That's such a good example. It's such a great real life example.
Is this me?
Hit it.
So our next set of techniques that we're going to teach you about is, you know, sometimes in the heat of the moment when you're receiving that feedback, or you need to give the feedback about something that has really upset you and made you angry, we all could use a little training on some techniques to sort of protect against those corrosive elements. Because you know, when you don't keep your cool in that moment, you're going to ruin relationships. You are going to damage the work that you're doing. So we're going to teach you now two evidence-based techniques that you can use to sort of keep your cool, de-escalate one of those feedback situations. And they're called the 6-second interruption and fogging.
So the fogging technique is great. So we've talked about some keystone practices that you incorporate systemically, organizationally. But what do you do? I mean, there are those moments, there are those meetings and those conversations where someone is in your face, really just giving it to you. How do you de-escalate from there, right? If the goal is a sustainable team that works together to advance the welfare and justice for survivors of sexual assault, how do we handle those interpersonal moments? So the first technique is a fogging technique. When you're faced with someone who is angry or is being aggressively critical, you try this. And maybe they're picking out a fault or something that you have done wrong. You can either, one, you can agree with a tiny portion of the statement that happens to be true. You could also agree with maybe a general principle underlying what they're saying. And really finding any kind of kernel of truth. It's just any little anchor. And the reason that you do this, if you think about real fog, this is why this works. What do you do when you're driving and fog rolls in, right? Fog, it blurs everything. It takes the sharpness off of things, but it also obscures things. So when you're driving, what do y'all do? You take your foot off the gas, right? You slow down. This gets us back into that active listening mode. It gets us back to that inquiry mode. As well as it takes the person who's being really critical off guard. They don't expect you to agree with anything they've just said. They're geared up for a fight. So this is what that looks like in practice. Julie calls me up. Oh, Julie, we've got this presentation for TASA. Erica, you were supposed to get those slides to me by Tuesday, and it is Friday. And I start, I know, oh, Erica, no, Erica, I don't want to hear it. You are always so unprofessional. Okay, what do I do here, right? I can get in a fight with Julie, and that destroys our rapport and our friendship, or I can go, oh, Julie, honey, I agree with you. I know it is totally frustrating when someone promises you something and then they don't deliver it on time and we've got a deadline. I totally agree with you. That is frustrating. And that's why I emailed you and said, I'm just waiting on Kelsey's stats before I can finalize that slide. I'll get it to you ASAP. That's what fogging looks like in the moment. Another technique that you can use is called the 6-second technique. I think this is particularly important because when we work in trauma-based work, we're often given the message that if we want to be professional, there's no room for emotions, either in our work or in systemic work. When in fact, it really can't be farther from the truth, because emotions are nothing but data. Emotions are data that give us information. So emotions are peptides. And what I'm going to show you here is this amazing, amazing artwork. Don't be jealous. I know it's going to be going into the Blanton very soon. But emotions are peptides. They're actually these little peptides in our brain, and the key is a peptide. And what peptides do is they're looking for either a threat or they're looking for an opportunity. They look for a lock. And what happens when a peptide finds a lock? As soon as it finds one that fits, it goes bing, and it creates 2 more. And then it doubles again, and then it doubles. And as you can see, it doubles and it doubles. And what they call this in neuroscience is the cascade effect. I want you all to think about what this feels like in the body. This is either when you are about to jump for joy, okay? Somebody is going down on bended knee to give you that ring, or conversely in our work, this is when you are getting heated up. Your blood is boiling, your pulse is racing, you're getting sweaty, you're about to blow your top, about to explode. The really neat thing is, on the one hand, it's scary because it takes 6 seconds for this to happen. 6 seconds. The beautiful thing about it is that it takes 6 seconds to interrupt the peptides. So if you can do something for 6 seconds, you stop this. All of that stops. And what science has shown us is that interrupting our 5 senses can stop that cascade. Almost nothing needs to be replied to in 6 seconds. So drink a sip of cold water. If you have mints at your desk, spearmint, peppermint has been shown to stop that cascade in the brain. It has a very physical, biological effect. If you've got lavender on your desk or hand-scented oils, anything that you can use your 5 senses for, do it for 6 seconds. And you'll interrupt that peptide chain, and you'll find that although not everything is hunky-dory and rosy, you'll find that you've interrupted that cascade of emotions. Everybody can take a breath and chill out, and you'll be surprised at how you can de-escalate in the moment. It's a really great tactic.
And here's my little plug. When I learned this tactic, I started using it with my kids. And I have an 11-year-old little girl who is a fast pitch softball pitcher. She is also a hothead. So if she throws a pitch that she thinks should have been called a strike, and the stupid umpire wasn't wearing his glasses and doesn't call it a strike, she will turn around and throw that next pitch so fast, and it is guaranteed to go sailing over the catcher's head because she is hot. If I can get her as the mom coach to take 6 seconds, and I actually call out to her on the mound, count to 6. If I get her to stop that, count to 6, next pitch is always a strike, guaranteed. So this works in all aspects of your life, not just your multidisciplinary teams. So the final keystone we want to talk to you about today is institutionalization. And we all know that this is so important in SART teams, multidisciplinary teams, and criminal justice in general, because what happens is we get one cheerleader, we get one really excited person who starts these teams or who puts something in process, and then they leave us, right? They go do some other job or they retire. In some way, they leave us and the entire system falls apart. So how do we make sure that these systems are strong and they outlast any one individual? And so first, you have to incorporate your guiding principles. As we've talked about earlier, clear, explicit guiding principles that, when agreed upon, set your mission and purpose for your multidisciplinary team and direct members how to get back to the core of your mission when things get too heated. Second, you need to put it in writing, whether that's a team handbook, whether that's a training manual for new members as they join your team, however it's going to look. All of these things need to be in writing, and your guiding mission and principle should probably just be posted on your wall wherever your team meets, so you can all have that visual reminder. We all need to remember that inquiry is a process, and that when we act from inquiry, we need to incorporate that into our processes as well. Case reviews, audits, rather than making it personal, asking about what went wrong. Not who did wrong, what went wrong on this occasion. And then finally, especially in sexual assault, it's so important that we get our teams to focus on offenders. For so long, we have talked about what she was wearing, who she was with, was she drinking, where did she go? And our focus has not been on that person who is sexually offending. So how do we do that? How do we get our teams to become more offender focused? So here would be an example. My SART team decides, you know what, we have not been focused enough on offenders. And as a system, we want to hold them more accountable. And we discuss how we can do that. One way we can do that is by having forensic exams for suspects. We recognize that it's not being consistently done in our jurisdiction, that forensic exams of suspects are being done. And we also know, and as a prosecutor, I can tell you that when the perpetrator says it never happened, finding the victim's DNA on the perpetrator is just as good as finding the perpetrator's DNA on the victim. And we expect and encourage our victims to go through a forensic exam. So why aren't we doing them? So we decide as a team, this is something we want to undertake. Well, we're going to have to make a lot of decisions. Who's going to conduct that exam? Where will it be done? When will it be done? What are the time parameters? We don't want to take our suspects to the same SANE center or emergency department where our victim might be, right? We don't want any cross there. So we have to figure out the protocol. We have to write it down, and then we have to train all of our SART members. This is the new protocol. And that means training your SART members to go back and train their departments. So all patrol officers, all investigators, everybody knows this is the protocol. And then we need to follow up with an oversight audit or review, right? Every year, every other year, looking at case level, system level. Are we doing the forensic exams in every case? If not, why not? Where is the breakdown? Do we not have enough people trained to do them? Do we not have enough locations to send our suspects? And what did we learn at the end of that review? Is this a reasonable policy and protocol, or does it need to be changed or tweaked to be more effective? So in this one way, we could make our system more offender focused if we follow these steps of a written protocol and policy training everyone who needs to know about it, and then checking to make sure we're actually doing what we said we'd do.
Hi, Julie. Can I butt in real quick just to recognize some of the comments? People loving the map, loving the puns. I did hear some Allison mentioned when you shoot the messenger, you stop getting messages. That is very true. I love that. I'm gonna put it on my wall. There's a comment by Halle. I also add the importance of centering the survivor's experience and needs. I think sometimes, I think that is missed in some ways. I also have a question or a thought, if I can just slide this in, because I feel like all this information is so vital, especially when folks are starting SARTs, which we do have a new law. That often, in my experience, often there's a lack of understanding of systemic racism or systemic sexism and institutional kind of like issues that relate to the issues that you might experience in multidisciplinary teams when it comes to law enforcement and prosecution. And so when we're talking about challenges, you know, we might be talking in the sense of a systemic issue, but oftentimes I've learned that those people in systems don't actually understand systemic oppression. And so they internalize the issues that you're talking about. And I think that makes it feel like, okay, we're talking about the system, but now this person is feeling blamed. But it's really because there's not an understanding of, you know, the system is not set up, or there are system limitations. And so do you have anything to say about, you know, how we get to that point where people within systems understand that we're not talking personally, but about the systemic barriers that continue to put survivors in the cracks of our systems? Does that make sense?
It does, Julie. If you don't mind, I'll take a first crack, because it also kind of leads into the next slide. So when I joined New Jersey and I took over heading up their domestic violence fatality and near fatality review board, we did that in some very specific ways. I mean, unlike a teacher with her summer reading assignments, right? We couldn't necessarily force everybody to read or to be educated on a lot of these issues. So this was a statewide board. It had people coming from multiple disciplines, systems, different levels of accountability and leadership within state government. So one way that we tried to figure out, how do we share that kind of information, Amanda, that you were talking about, how do we get them to be informed, right? How do we push through whether it's natural ignorance or whether it's willful ignorance? So the ways that we did that is we decided who should be on that team. And that's like building your bridge. So one way to do that is to have these materials as part of your handbook. When you're having people, when you're even designing a process, how do people even get on your SART team, or how do people become part of your community response? We didn't have a lot of power at the time. We later did. We were able to change some laws, but we couldn't choose. So we had this 2-page sort of form where people who were being appointed to our multidisciplinary team had to explain what they knew about. And then it was fill in those things. So whether that was racism, homophobia, whether it was cultural awareness, whether it was about misogyny and some of those gender components, we at least put it out there. Hey, you need to know this stuff. This is part of our victim-centered mission, is to look at these big things and then look at small things. So I would say you can put that into your processes. You can have a list of resources in that. I mean, a handbook sounds silly, but it does several things for you. It puts everybody on notice that this is what we expect from you. You may not have authority here, but this is what we expect. then make it easy for them to know that. Maybe you have a list of resources, maybe that's in your handbook, or maybe that's on a blog. I understand I'm seeing something about a lot of people, if they're not even communicating or don't even have access, how do you get that out to them? But it's those types of things that we incorporated in a granular way that did that. I think the other thing, again, just going back to that no blame, no shame, is also not shaming people coming onto your board or participating when they're trying to know better, to do better. And so again, having that clear mission, that clear scope, making sure that it's victim-centered, always being able to go back to that as a touchstone was really important. And so, for example, in fatality reviews, I trained under Neil Websdale, who founded the National Domestic Violence Fatality Review. And he puts this language very specifically in all fatality reviews. And it says that we need to have an ethos of accountability versus blame. Number one, because that encourages the covering up. It's called tombstone technology or mentality in aviation and nuclear power. And it's this idea that if we can't talk about mistakes, if we can't talk about either individual or systemic failures, or the big things like racism and homophobia and sexism, then we're just going to continue to cover up, right? We're going to cover up mass fatalities, mass casualties, and that it also just perpetrates the behavior of batterers or abusers or rapists, right? Who blame their victims, who put blame on them. They caused this, they made this happen. We can't, at a systemic level, do the things that perpetrators do on an individual level. And so again, this is just a great example. I encourage all of you, you can head to the National Domestic Violence Fatality Review Initiative's website, or I'm certainly happy to talk. But what was exciting is that when they put this into practice, it's now in over 45 states. We are seeing early data. The data is even more now than when we did the slide, but we're seeing that it's actually reducing domestic violence fatalities, and it's keeping sustainable victim-centered teams together in practice.
All right. Amanda, I hope you feel like we got your question answered, or whoever had put the question out that you synthesized so well for us. I know we're running out of time. We're coming to the end here. And again, this is a little bit preaching to the choir, but I know that every time I attended a conference as a prosecutor and I came back super excited about what I learned and what I was going to do to change the system, it would only take about 2 weeks for me to feel beat down by that system that I returned to, right? And Edward Deming, who's kind of all about systems, right? And a founder of systems, a father of systems, said a bad system will beat a good person every time. And so it's not enough for one person in this system to get trained to do things better. We really have to focus on system change if we want better outcomes for victim survivors. Because, and my example here, and I'll do it quick, but after being a sex assault prosecutor for a long time, I went to a new jurisdiction. And the day I was unpacking my office, the detective walks in, the lead detective, and introduces himself and basically says, "We know who you are. We've heard about you. We know you're the sex assault lady," basically, right? And I just wanted to make sure you knew that you wouldn't be getting any cases here. And, you know, when I kind of picked my jaw up off the floor, I said, "Well, why is that? Why wouldn't I see any sexual assault cases?" And he said, "The last prosecutor who had your seat wouldn't charge any of them. And so my officers got tired of doing all the hard work of investigating only to have the case decline." And, you know, it took some time and some work to rebuild that relationship, but I definitely said, "Hey, I'm not that guy. Send me the cases. I want to see them, right? Do the work and I will reward your work." But what I saw was that one bad prosecutor had changed the entire system in that community because judges and juries were not seeing cases, right? Police officers, prosecutors, and advocates were not working together. I had to re-educate a whole bunch of judges because no one in that community thought that sexual assault happened. all because of one prosecutor not charging cases. He had impacted the entire system. So as much as a bad system will beat one good person down, one bad person in your system can infect and impact every area of your system.
Okay, I know we're hitting time. We would normally ask if any of you have any questions.
You know what? And the mentee might take too long. So if there are
do it in the
questions,
chat.
you're not going to cut us off, just put them in chat, because I don't want to waste the 30 seconds or 60 seconds they're still going to give us.
And Julie can put up our email. Here's how you can please reach out to us. We'd love to continue the conversation. If you have any questions or need any resources from this or other things.
Or if you're looking for trainings for your teams, half day, full day trainings, Erica and I are available to come in and try and share some of this information with your team as a whole, and hopefully make your process smoother and more sustainable.
And more practice, more fun things when we can be together in person as well. It's hard on Zoom. Thank you all so much.
I see a note to everyone that says, make sure you complete your evaluation. And in the chat, there is a link to it. So make sure.
Because we wanted to know if we've got spinach in our teeth. Okay. So let us know how we can do this better. Let us know how we can improve.
Thank you both so much. We're not going to kick you off just yet because we do. I mean, it's lunch after this. So I will say, if anyone wants to, if y'all have the time, you know, we can stay on for a couple more minutes, but also don't want to interfere with anyone's lunch plans. So please feel free to log off. Thank you, Julie and Erica. I really appreciate y'all, you know, speaking to the importance of collaboration and having those relationships with the community partners. And again, the link is in the link for the evaluation is in the chat box. My hangry brain is going to start kicking in. And if anyone has any questions, you can stay on and put those in the chat, or you can email them. TASA is also available for SART support as well, too. So I'll just put that little thing out there as well. Thank y'all so much. We really appreciate you for facilitating this workshop. And thank you to our amazing interpreters. We really appreciate you both. Thank you.
Thank you, interpreters. And I will, if Julie and Erica are still with us, I do see a couple of questions here. If we can really quick try to get to them. Kristen Linnell asks, oh, what does she ask? Okay, I think the challenges there in most Texas communities don't have options in terms of who sits on their CCR, and survivors don't get the choice when they report. It would be so valuable to have a framework for dealing with problems after they already are problems. So, you know, and I think I've seen that too, where we don't necessarily get to set up the framework to have that healthy communication. But when there are already the storming issues, you know, and just being at TASA, we often hear tales of survivors being railroaded or advocates being railroaded by the system. What are some thoughts that y'all have about kind of being maybe in a lower power position, but wanting to influence that system without using blame and shame?
So I know for me, again, just even though I've done SART work as well, for me, the fatality review was really helpful because in the beginning, we were a government entity, and the folks that were getting put on that team were incredibly political. At one point, we were working on standards for, I'm sorry, this was actually another job. Here's a better one for sexual assault. I was working on doing standards for SART in New Jersey, particularly looking at hospitals, law enforcement, and advocacy. And I was told, you just can't use rape. And I was like, okay, I'm sorry. We're working on standards for rape victims, but I can't use, you know, the word rape. And so those power dynamics were horrible. We were like, how are we going to do this? And we translated that into fatality review when we, again, we had no official power, but to put people, to communicate in whatever ways you can, that you are watching them, that you expect people who know what they're doing and who are victim-centered. When you start out being very explicit about that, that's one small step that builds you towards there. So I hear what you're saying. I hear that you're saying, so what? They can just ignore that, or they can, they don't have to do that. But that takes, after enough time, when you keep signaling again and again and again that you're going to hold them accountable in whatever way you can. Maybe that's by their expertise. Maybe it's just by watching. Maybe it's publishing a report and what you publish in that report. Another thing that we did is we got buy-in at the beginning. We went to the folks that were members of those different systems and we're like, we are producing a report about what's working well and what's not working well in New Jersey. And we might have had subtopics. And we'd love to hear from you. What is it that you need to do a better job for victims? What issues are you having? And that was the first hook, right? What is it that you need? We could include that in our report. And then the second thing is, what problems do you see that you could change? And we'll publish that. And then together we can look at how long that might take you. So when we went in more as partners, more as allies, that approach ended up building the relationships where we didn't have actual authority or power. So that's what I would say in terms of just set up a cold meeting with folks, and approaching it from that perspective can really help.
And I just want to add a couple things. I would say you have to treat your policy and protocol for your SART as a living document, right? So when something is not working, you have to be willing, and you also have to have a protocol for how we're going to change protocol, right? So it's a lot of protocol. How are we going to change something when it's not working? And do we need 100% agreement to change something? Or do we need 75% agreement? Do we need the agency that it involves? Most certainly, if the protocol involves a particular agency, you're going to need them on board. The other thing, because I've had a lot of struggles with people who come to the table and just they're forced to be there by the sheriff. They don't want to participate. They don't like it. So I would say that starts back with your MOU from that department to send somebody to the table. There should be very specific guidelines. This is what's expected of the person that you commit to our MDT. It's not just a warm body. I don't want just a warm body. I want somebody who does the following things: shows up to meetings, has whatever extra assignment they have, participates in this way. And then when they're failing on those duties, you have something to go to the sheriff and say, you know what, when you signed this MOU, you committed to giving us a person with this qualities, and these are the struggles we're having. And maybe in that way get someone new assigned when you have that person who's just not going to play nicely in the sandbox.
Thank you so much. I think that's a great place to end. Thanks for letting us keep y'all another 8 minutes. Thanks for the interpreters for staying another 8 minutes.
Interpreters, you're awesome.
Yes, yes. Thanks everyone, and enjoy your lunch, and see you back after lunch.
Take care, everyone. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye.